Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing a Sharks season in review. This first one will be of the 09-10 season for the Sharks. So as some of you may have seen, I made a video ranking the Sharks seasons of this past decade from 09-10 to 18-19, judging by which team really had the best chance in their specific year to win the Stanley Cup, 1 to 10, and also, as you will know, I've had this channel for a couple of years now. I reviewed every single game for the Sharks in the 19-20 season, almost every single game for the Sharks in the 18-19 season, including all of the playoffs, but I have been watching the Sharks for many years before that, and so let's start with the first season of this past decade, the 09-10 season. The Sharks came into this year after a pretty disappointing 08-09. While the Sharks managed to win the regular season by getting the President's Trophy, which is certainly an accomplishment in and of itself. Coming into the playoffs, this is really where they started to earn that cliche of the Sharks being a choker, as they came up against the Anaheim Ducks in the first round, the 8th seed that year in the Western Conference, and they lost in just 6 games. And this wasn't necessarily the case like when the Kings were the 8th seed and in 2012 beat first place in the Western Conference and went on to win the Stanley Cup. While the Ducks were still a decent team, and in the second round they put up a pretty good fight against the Detroit Red Wings, they still ended up losing in that second round. So it's not like the Ducks were some sort of diamond in the rough team. It was just a disappointing loss all around for the Sharks. So this season, this 09-10 season, they came in with a 51-20-11 record. Not enough to win the President's Trophy, as the Washington Capitals were just so good that season, but it was enough to win the Western Conference 1 point ahead of the eventual Stanley Cup champion, Chicago Blackhawks. So in terms of points, it were some pretty, normal faces leading the teams, faces that even if you were just a Sharks fan this season, you'd recognize most of these names, or a few of these names at least. Thornton leading the way, 79 games played with 20 goals and 69 assists for 89 points. Patrick Marleau, 82 games, as of course the Iron Man streak was there. 44 goals, 39 assists for 83 points. That's a career high in goals for Marleau that season. Danny Heatley, Old Shark, 82 games played, 39 goals, 43 assists for 82 points. Dan Boyle, who was the power play quarterback, I guess you could say, before Brent Burns came in a few years, Brent Burns was there a year later, but so was Dan Boyle for a couple more years until he retired. 76 games played with 15 goals, 43 assists, 58 points. Fan favorite Ryan Clough, 82 games played, 19 goals, 38 assists for 57 points. And a pretty young Joe Pavelski at the age of 25 for most of that season. 67 games played, 25 goals, 26 assists for 51 points. Then it was Evgeni Nabokov's final season as the starter for the San Jose Sharks, and he played 71 games, 44 wins, 2.43 GAA, and a .922 save percentage. So very, very good goaltending stats there. And just the fact that he started 71 games, it wasn't as strange at that time as it would be right now. If a goaltender started 71 games, people would call that coach insane. Most starters might not even get into the 60s unless a team is really desperate to ride that starter sort of into the ground. But back then, while it wasn't common to play 71 games, there were a couple of goaltenders like Nabokov or maybe like Brodeur. Lundqvist could definitely approach that number, where those goaltenders would get that time because it was just sort of a different era, even if it was only just a few years ago. So Nabokov didn't seem to be all too tired, but maybe that was a reason why the Sharks never really got super far with him in the playoffs. In the first round, however, going into the playoffs, the Sharks would face off against the Avalanche, the 8th seed of that year, 43-30-9. As I said, considering the Sharks lost to the Ducks in the first round in the previous year, they were not to take the Avalanche lightly, and the first 4 games were extremely close, as this series really could have gone either way. The first game in San Jose, the Sharks lost, which was certainly something that could have really put a damper on the morale there, losing 2-1 in that first game. In the second game, however, they would get an overtime win 6-5, but the third game, the first game in Colorado in the series, they'd lose 1-0 in overtime in a game that they were mostly dominant in, but would end up losing when Dan Boyle would seemingly put the puck in his own net. So the Sharks would trail 2-1 going into a Game 4 still in Colorado. However, the Sharks did seem to wake up there. They'd get a 2-1 win to make the tie at 2-2 before getting pretty clean 5-0 and 5-2 wins to win the series in 6 games. So the Sharks would move on to the second round, and they'd face off against the Detroit Red Wings, the 5th seed of the year in the Western Conference. 44 wins, 24 losses, and 14 overtime losses. It should be mentioned that, of course, the format back in 09-10 was different than what the format is now. Besides the fact that now there's 31 teams and back then there was 30 teams, it was still separated into 2 conferences, but instead of 2 divisions per conference, conference. There were 3 divisions per conference, 5 teams each. The division leader of each division would be first, second, and third in their respective conference, and then the 4th through 8th team would just be sorted by points. So the Red Wings were 5th there. And so they also should not have been taken lightly. This ended up being a very impressive series win for the Sharks because the Red Wings were coming off just 2 years ago winning the Stanley Cup and just the previous year making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, only losing out to the Pittsburgh Penguins. And so the first 3 games would all finish by a score of 4-3, all in favor of the Sharks, though the third game would go to overtime before a pretty disastrous Game 4, losing 7-1, Johan Franzen scoring 4 goals. I remember that vividly. But this was, of course, a few years prior to the whole reverse sweep thing with the Los Angeles Kings, so it was never really super worrying that the Sharks would let anything bad happen here, and in Game 5 they would close it out with a 2-1 victory and would move on to the conference final, the top 4 in the NHL, where they would meet the Chicago Blackhawks. And these were the 2 best teams in the Western Conference, considering the Capitals got upset in the first round by the Montreal Canadiens on the Eastern Conference side. Many viewed these 2 teams as the best teams left in the league, and so whoever won this one looked to have a pretty good chance of being able to win the Stanley Cup. Though when you took a look on paper at both of these teams, the Blackhawks did seemingly have the advantage. A lot of people were coming into this series thinking the Blackhawks could take the win, even though they were only 1 point behind the Sharks. Even though they were 1 point behind the Sharks in the regular season standings, you take a look at this Blackhawks team, even then, of course we know now how these players turned out, but even then, they had Taves and Kane coming into their prime, a prime Dustin Byfuglien, who was actually playing forward at the time, I believe, prime Duncan Keith, prime Brent Seabrook. They had a very good Brian Campbell, prime Dave Boland, who was very good at the time as well. Patrick Sharp was still looking quite sharp, I guess, pardon the pun. And so while this series shouldn't have been only 4 games, it's not a huge surprise necessarily that the Sharks ended up losing. There was definitely a chance to win, but the Blackhawks were a very good team that year. In the first couple of games at home for San Jose, they lost 2-1 and 4-2. In Game 3, they'd lose 3-2 in overtime, and in Game 4, they'd lose 4-2. Really, the main weakness of the Blackhawks was on the goaltending side. That was really the possible thing to expose for them, but Antti Niemi had an extremely good series for the Chicago Blackhawks. Maybe a reason, or a big reason, why the Sharks would eventually try and pick up Antti Niemi and succeed at doing exactly that for the next few years of having him as the starter. But that would do it for the Sharks season that year, and it would really begin a decade of which the Sharks would be very good, but there'd always be that one team who just seemed to be one step ahead of them, and the Blackhawks were that team this season. This was also, of course, the start of the Blackhawks dynasty, I guess you could say, winning the Cup that year, as well as eventually in 2013 and 2015. In terms of points in the playoffs for the Sharks players, Joe Pavelski led the way. It was really a breakout year for Pavelski in the playoffs, a very good series against the Avalanche as well as the Red Wings, though against the Blackhawks, nobody was really all that great for the Sharks forward-wise. Pavelski, as I said, leading the way, 15 games played, so all of them, 9 goals, 8 assists, and 17 points. Boyle, 15 games played, 2 goals, 12 assists for 14 points. Marleau and Heatley, the only 2 players on this list who played less than the 15 games, both playing 14. Marleau there, 8 goals, 5 assists, and 13 points. Heatley with only 2 goals in the playoffs with 11 assists and 13 points. Thornton, 3 goals, 9 assists, 12 points. And then Ryan Clough, 2 goals, 8 assists for 10 points. Nabokov, of course, started every single game, got the 8 wins, as you'd expect after you win the first 2 rounds and get swept in the third round, and a 2.56 GAA and a .907 save percentage, so not nearly as good as they had been in the regular season. But that will do it for this season in review. In the end, it was an improved performance over the 08-09 season that the Sharks had previously. They again had a successful regular season, though I guess technically not as successful, but this time they actually performed decently well in the playoffs, and if it weren't for the Blackhawks really being this sort of unstoppable juggernaut that just really needed to find some sort of consistency, which they did end up having in their series against the Sharks could have potentially made it to the Stanley Cup Finals and facing off against a pretty good Philly team there, but the Blackhawks were able to dispatch of them. You know, the Sharks certainly had as good a chance as any, but class dismissed.